for International Politics from JNU is joining us on the broadcast as well. Professor Singh, thank you so much for speaking to News 9. I want to understand from you, sir, given, Nepal's constitutional history and the transition that the country has taken since the year of 2008, and looking at this newer generation's unrest, all of them pouring out in huge numbers, the masses there on roads, torching several official residences. I want to understand from you, what does it indicate about the health of the democratic institutions of Nepal?
I think the first fundamental problem or challenge that democracy in Nepal is facing is that no party has any clear, decisive mandate to make the government. There are, I think, about 12 parties currently in parliament, and the largest parties' numbers are about 89, which means they are constantly going to work with each other, and that has seen that the leadership as Prime Minister is constantly rotating between, sort of 3 or 4 major leaders, KP Sharma Oli, Madhav Nepal, or Prachanda. And I think that has ensured enormous instability. The projects are not able to be carried forward in long-term perspective, and economic deceleration and corruption, because when leaders come to position with complete uncertainty, are not able to be carried forward in long-term perspective, and economic deceleration and corruption, because when leaders come to position with complete uncertainty as to how long they will be staying where they are. And that has, over a period of time, created enormous dissatisfaction. And because the other side of the story is the young population in Nepal, which is increasingly tech-savvy because of access to social media platforms, which make them aware of what is happening around the world. And that not only makes them much more aspirational, it also makes them much more anxiety prone. We often hear about digital natives having problems of sleeplessness or perfectionism and so on, and depression sometimes. But fundamentally, access to social media and constant gradual incremental increase of dissatisfaction with the ruling elite suddenly bursts out because of the social media connect. And we have noticed how suddenly things can happen, whether you look at the example of Sri Lanka before this, more recently in Bangladesh, and leaderless movements largely led by younger people, mostly students. And that's a new phenomenon. And once you see that juxtaposed against a government which has no clear mandate and leader who is not clearly given mandate by people to form the government, that constant instability and anxiety at the popular level means that both sides are disconnected. The state or the government is perhaps not in know of where the society is going, what are the problems the society is facing, what are those aspirations of young people that are making them so upset with the things around them. So fundamentally, what is happening now is we see a clash between one side, the protesters, saying that the culture of corruption is rampant, and social media is helping them unravel that culture of corruption. State, on the other side, the political elite is reversing the argument and saying it is the social media which is corrupting the culture, and therefore it's a question of national dignity and the need for digital accountability, etc. And in this direct confrontation, you have these multinational...
I'll request you to please stay with me. I have some very interesting visuals to show my viewers, since you have also touched upon how the situation is pretty much similar to what has happened in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh also. We are flashing the visuals of Sri Lanka back from 2022. Then comes Bangladesh from last year, what happened there. And now we are looking at the visuals coming in from the lanes of Nepal in the year 2025. Professor, coming back to you, we have already shown these very interesting visuals, and how parallelly these three situations are running to each other. you have also highlighted the fact that the unrest is very much similar to what had happened in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, of course. And will Nepal will see the future as both of those nations? But speaking of Nepal's strategic positioning and influence of India and China over there, I want to understand from you how the government will respond to the domestic dissent happening at this large scale at the moment, and what does it mean for India also?
Let me tackle both of your questions. The first is comparisons with what we saw in Sri Lanka and we saw more recently in Bangladesh. Apparently, at first look, yes, there are similarities. There is a leaderless, popular upsurge of young people being very upset, taking on to streets and sustaining that violence. It's not just a few hours or few days, but there are also, remember, important differences. Sri Lanka had a whole history of societal divide and civil war for several decades that preceded it. That's not the case in case of Nepal. In case of Bangladesh, then of course there was also clearly certain amount of reticent or role of army as to how the Prime Minister was made to exit and her security could not be guaranteed. And both these sometimes also are understood in terms of external players trying to do regime change. So in case of Sri Lanka, for example, there were debates about whether US aid had any role, whether National Endowment of Democracy had any role. In case of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister herself has said United States and CIA themselves had a role in toppling of her government. Remember, similar things were also said by Imran Khan, that his government was also toppled by US intervention. Those things are not clearly as of now visible in case of Nepal. That brings us to the second question of China-India being important influences in both society and politics and economy of Nepal. What is interesting is that at this stage, we have KP Sharma Oli as Prime Minister. And in my own personal assessment, Nepal has not produced a more pro-Beijing leader that can be compared with KP Sharma Oli. In fact, you remember during the 7 days notice that was given to all these companies to register under regulations 2080 in Nepal, Prime Minister Oli was in Beijing, witnessing the 80th anniversary of World War II victory, and that parade he was watching there. And of course, he was back in Nepal in time that these protests erupted. But also, second part, the only social media which is currently open and is freely being used is TikTok, again a Chinese application. Which means at least the Chinese are likely to have certain access to what is being communicated among people in general, because that's a major social media platform which is still active, and it is active because they had complied till August last year. They had complied with all the requirements of digital accountability, and at that time they were banned for last 9 months, and then ban was lifted at that time last year. So it's not completely conspiracy theory that I'm building, but there is a possibility of both the political elite led by KP Sharma Oli and at the popular level protesters using social media, TikTok, that China would have certain connection. But India's connection with Nepal are very much unlike Chinese. Estimates go as far as between 7, 8 to up to 10 lakh non-resident Indians in Nepal. And of course, estimates of Nepalese in India are still more uncertain, and numbers often come from 10 lakh to 30 lakh Nepalese in India. 30,000 Nepalese fight in Indian Army. They are part of Indian Armed Forces. 100,000 Nepalese are in Nepal but are pensioners of India in that sense. So that's a very unusual connect, and that is why you see India's concerns about that unrest and chaos continuing in Nepal are bound to be very different. I mean, this is a genuine, real problem for India in case that chaos continues. In fact, I understand that Indian Ministry of External Affairs has already issued advisories to Indians in Nepal, and perhaps the caution on the border has also been sort of increased to make sure that unusual impact doesn't suddenly, come in the Indian side, or tension doesn't kind of make Nepal see any link of India in this. So sometimes politicians want to also exploit that. And of course, historically, whenever there have been continuous enormous problems in any of the neighboring countries, there is a temptation among political leaders to, push the blame onto India and explain India being the reason for problems. So India has a very different reason to be very, very alert and take note of things happening on the ground on day-to-day basis. And I also always say, if the protests continue for a longer period of time, then a lot of other people who may not have direct connection with the cause for which the protests begin could also join. For example, certain political outfits, political parties could see it as an opportunity to join and support, endorse the protests. Some kind of other entrepreneurs. I mean, sometimes you have musicians trying out their luck to become popular, going in the protests and singing protest-related songs. Sorry to say, but even criminals could also be increasingly getting into protests. So what I'm underlining is need to control this as soon as possible, and I think it is very clear that given the chaos, and I started by saying that the parliament has no clear mandate from 2022 elections, the only way possible is that Prime Minister could perhaps declare that we need to have fresh elections, set up a national caretaker government of some kind to also take protesters in kind of reckoning and offer them that government is more than willing to engage them to explore shared common solutions to the problem. And in case it has to be a fresh election in search of a clear mandate as to who should be governing Nepal, that could also be a possible strategy. But apparently the anger with the three leaders on top is palpable, visible among protesters so far. And I think that has to be understood, because sometimes even the younger politicians are also there, but they are not really they don't have much political weight to take decisions, and sometimes they are only continuing family traditions, is one way of looking at how children of politicians are also having much luxurious life with sort of vacationing around the world, and some other youth is being exposed to that kind of lifestyle on social media, but is facing much more difficult circumstances and unemployment, deprivation of opportunities. And that also, I think, is something that creates anxieties, unrest, grievances. And it's not just case of Nepal. I think that applies to most societies where a sudden exposure to only the good side of life, which we see on social media, sometimes creates a very, very biased understanding as to how life is in general, and how each one of us may have a very different experience of life, and collectively creates anxiety. In fact, if you have another 30 seconds, I want to refer
Absolutely. Please go on. Please go on, Professor.
There was a New York Times bestseller book last year called The Anxious Generation. It's a very popular book written by Jonathan Haidt, who basically talks about unique life of Generation Z, which is what is being said to be behind the protests right now in Nepal. And the fundamental argument he's making, Generation Z, of course, everyone knows, is people born between 1995, 6, 7 to 2012, 13, 14, etc. And that generation, he says, is the first generation that the childhood experience was not in real open spaces in playgrounds, but life experiences of childhood were on phone screens or tablets screens, etc., which has hardwired their mindset in a very different fashion. And how this generation is the first generation that collectively has faced enormous new issues of sleep deprivation, of social comparisons, addictions, perfectionism, even depression. And also on the positive side, these digital natives are also much more diverse in terms of being open to alternative ideas. They are also sometimes more inclusive. They are also more entrepreneurial sometimes. So there are both sides, positive and negative, but how this generation is uniquely different. And that sometimes also needs to be understood as to how, when we keep talking about aspirational youth, beyond that sloganeering about aspirational youth, we have to understand their mindset. And I think that the authorities at various levels, whether they're schools, universities, or health care facilities, government decision making in all other sectors, have to cater to this new generation of Gen Z, which is enormously different in terms of both their capacity to be productive, but also their capacity to be disruptive. And I think that disconnect again is very clearly visible in some of our societies, where you see these protests suddenly erupting and creating chaos, because the older generation, which is where senior politicians invariably control the government, perhaps need to better connect with their own aspirational young population, and make sure that they become much more productive and sort of create a better life for everybody, instead of being having a sense of grievance and disconnection with authorities that we, and then protests burst out the way they did. So I
Absolutely,
think that is a challenge which is generally everywhere, and we are noticing currently that clearly unraveling itself in case of protests in Nepal.
Absolutely, Professor. And something very, crucial here. We are again flashing the images from 3 different countries in 3 different years, and all of them being led by the youth of the nation. Of course, the pattern was different, the issues were also different, but the stark similarity remains the involvement of the youth of the nation, and also the kind of uprising that they have shown because of the agitation, the irritation, the complaints from their administration. Professor, if I could also ask you, what exactly is the solution here? Do you think that maybe some of the international organizations like that of the UN, or some of the NGOs, or maybe some of the international factors, in fact India in Nepal's case as well, or China or US for that matter, can actually play a key role in facilitating reconciliation or institutional reform as far as the picture in Nepal is concerned?
My immediate response would be that since the anxiety and anger of young people who are protesting has more or less clearly identified who they are angry with, which is the 2-3 leaders that are invariably in the commanding position in Nepalese politics for several years now. Any of them trying to utilize external players may not really be seen as a solution. There could also be then interpretations of who those agencies or actors are that are being brought into seeking solutions. That will definitely happen and can happen, but once they have identified how they wish to get out of this deadlock of constant protests and no solutions to protests as of now. And that must be done only between the leaders who are in position now in Nepal and the protesters. Is something which is not easy to do, because that this is a leaderless kind of a situation. But as we saw in case of Bangladesh, one can gradually begin to identify leaders even among young people here. So sooner, I think that you will see that some faces begin to be visible as guiding lights in that larger protest. And once the government also begins to showcase its sincere interest in engaging the protesters, that could also encourage them to really identify a certain number of people among themselves as their leaders who could engage in communicating with the powers that are today, and then sit down and find out how they can resolve immediate situations. And in implementing those agreed upon consensus points is where I think external agencies or external actors could come either as monitors that the process is
Right.
happening exactly the way it should happen, or in facilitating, assisting, moving forward in seeking out those solutions.
Right, right.
But to me, I think the
Professor, my
fundamental-
apologies for interrupting you over there. Unfortunately, I've completely run out of time on the chat here at Newsline. But thank you so much for simplifying the details of Nepal's situation and how it can be matched with what happened in Sri Lanka, what happened in Bangladesh, and what will be the precedent that will be followed. We have the latest visual of, in fact, choppers flying over the residences of the